Now let's move down to the second of the 4 plot dynamic essential questions. This is the story limit, time lock or option lock. Well, you're all familiar with the time lock. That's like 48 hours, or the ticking bomb that has a countdown timer on it, or you've just swallowed poison. If you don't find the antidote in 24 hours, you're going to die. Oops, start the stopwatch, 24 hours to the second you will die. So all of these kinds of things are time locks. But what about option locks? Well, an option lock is a story in which all of the options are exhausted. The characters run out of options. Like, you have 3 wishes and only 3. And if you use them all up when you use the last wish, that's it. You're out of ammo. Or, speaking of ammo, you've got 100 rounds of ammunition to hold off the native warriors. When those 100 rounds are gone, you're finished. So you have to figure out the very best way to use them, how to dole them out. That's an option lock story. Question is then, is your story best brought to a close by the characters running out of time or running out of options? Well, why do you want to put a lock on your story at all anyway? What purpose does it serve? Well, here's the major purpose. An audience needs to know how big the scope of your argument is, how much territory your story is going to cover. Until they know how far you're going to go, they can't start putting the pieces of the puzzle together, because there may be something outside that area that is going to turn everything around. How many times have you sat and watched a television program and know that the program has to be over in 60 minutes? As a result of it, you know that these things have to be the way they are because there's simply no time for it to be anything else, so you can start putting the pieces together. You know, you say, gee, I wonder if he's it, I wonder if he's it, maybe this is going to happen. You look up at the clock, oh, they've only got 5 minutes left. Nope, that can't happen. Okay, that's how you figure it out. Now, that doesn't mean the story's a time lock. It means just like with a book, it could be 200 pages long, and if you're up at page 199, that there's just not enough space to put in enough words to change everything you've already read. That's a constraint of the medium. We're not talking about the medium here, we're talking about the story itself. Do the characters in the story run out of time because of something that's counting down in the story, or do they run out of options because they have a certain limited number of things they can try or a certain limited amount of resources, and then we watch it ticking down? Like in Beauty and the Beast, the Disney film. Would you say that's a time lock or an option lock? Think about it. What is the moment at which the story must be over? It's when the last petal falls off the rose that he has got under the crystal dome. Now when that last petal drops, it's all over. I said when it drops. The word when, does that mean it's a time lock? No, because there's no specific amount of time. It could take 80 years, 20 years, 2 minutes, doesn't matter. It's when the last petal drops. That's an option lock because there's a limited number of petals and we can count them down. When they get down to the last one, when it drops, it's all over. Good, bad, or indifferent, success, failure, happy, sad, doesn't matter. The story's over. That's as far as it can go. Or the 3 wishes like I mentioned before. Time locks and option locks. Think about a race as an example. Let's look at the race with the tortoise and the hare. Is that a time lock or an option lock? It's a race. Races take time, therefore it must be a time lock? No. Again, the race with the tortoise and the hare says whoever crosses the finish line first wins. It doesn't say whoever gets farther by 12 o'clock. You see, if it's whoever gets farther by 12 o'clock, then 12 o'clock is the limit. Any amount of distance could be had. Whoever's gone the greater amount of the distance by 12 o'clock, boom, 12 o'clock, that's when the story ends. You can watch it count down on your watch. But it's an option lock. It's not a time lock because it's how far, who's going to get there first. Here's the finish line. The finish line is in a particular place. That's the option. This is the space that you have to reach. It doesn't matter if it takes 3 days or it takes 2 days or 20 minutes again. It's whoever crosses the finish line first. Very important when thinking about your story to try and be really accurate as to whether it's time lock or an option lock that ends your story. What do you want to constrain things by? Another way of looking at that also is let's take one event, one race, the Indianapolis 500. Now is that a time lock or an option lock? Think about it. The Indianapolis 500. It's not the Indianapolis 500 minutes. That would be a time lock. It's the Indianapolis 500 miles. That's an option lock. They have a distance to cover, And some years they cover it in a large amount of time and some in a little bit of time. It depends on the caution flags, number of accidents, a lot of weather conditions. The point is, it doesn't matter how long it takes. Just like a marathon is not a time lock. The Indianapolis 500, fast cars moving very quickly. Everybody's looking at how long it takes them to get past each lap. Everybody's trying to see if they beat previous times, but the race itself is an option lock. Now the time trials to get the pole position, that's a time lock that happened before the race. Because when you're trying to beat a specific time, this guy's gone through and it's taken him this long. He sets the time. Now the moment he sets the time, it's time lock because everybody's trying to beat that time or beat somebody else's time to get the best pole position. Then you have a certain amount of time and you have to see how, if you can beat that amount of time to go the same distance. So now you're racing against the clock. Okay? Same distance, racing against the clock, rather than racing against each other. So time locks and option lock, they're a little difficult to figure out sometimes. It's not as easy as one might think. It's also complicated by the fact that in a lot of stories you'll find both in operation, but only one draws the story to a conclusion. For example, we'll take a little look here in Star Wars, or actually we won't use Star Wars, so I'll tell you about Star Wars. Star Wars, is that a time lock or an option lock? Well, you look to the end of it, you say, Death Star approaches within range in 15 minutes, or whatever it is, and you say, well, that's a time lock. Not true. You see, Star Wars, how long did it take? How long did the whole thing take? 2 days? 2 weeks? We don't know. Star Wars took as long as it took because it's set up at the very beginning that the Rebels are trying to get some plans that will help them destroy the Death Star. When Rebels and Death Star come together, however long it takes, just like the petals falling off the rose in Beauty and the Beast, that's when the options have been exhausted. That's when the final option clicks in place. That is an option lock. However, in the story, to make it more exciting, there is another lock put on as a superimposition, a template on top of things. That is the time lock that the Death Star will be here in 15 minutes. Now, we didn't know how long it would take from the beginning of the story. We knew how big the story would be, the scope of the argument, because it's when the Rebels get up next to the Death Star, when the two get in the same place, that's when the climax will be arrived at. That's when the story has to come to a conclusion. But you can put other locks on it. An example of a story in which this is not done very well, even though the rest of the movie is wonderfully told, is Speed, the original movie Speed. Is that a time lock or an option lock? What brings the story to a conclusion? Well, let's see. At the end of the story, we know that if they drop below 50 miles an hour, the bus is going to blow up. And we watch that he's put the bus on kind of autopilot by rigging it up with some straps. And just as it approaches that plane, now, look at it again. It's not running into the plane that makes the bus blow up. It blows up just before it gets there. They did that on purpose. Why did they do that? Because it's dropping in miles per hour and it gets down to 52, 51, 50, then it hits 49 just before it gets to the plane and then it blows up. Problem is, even though that's an option lock story, an option because there's no amount of time, it's just if it should drop below 50 miles an hour to blow up. It's an option lock ending, but it was a time lock beginning. They set up a time lock. Time lock where? Didn't they say right at the beginning if it dropped below that it would blow up? Yes. But what was the first thing they said? They said on the phone, the villain says to the hero, okay, I've got a bomb on board. And it's set to go off at 11 o'clock. Okay? And, in fact, he uses his gold watch they gave him when he retired because his fingers got blown off in an explosion. He uses that gold watch on the bomb, and we see it and recognize it as his gold watch on the bomb. That's part of what helps crack the case. The watch has a cracked case? No. No, the case in the story. The thing is that the bomb is going to go off at 11 o'clock no matter what. That's the limit, okay? Now, within that limit, you can put any number of constraints. Constraint 1, no passengers are allowed off the bus. Well, he gets him to allow a certain passenger off or something on the bus, and he himself gets off and everything. So that constraint can be eased a little bit through negotiation. The limit, however, cannot be because he can no longer control that watch. The watch is on the bus, and even the villain can't make it change time. That's the limit. And now, the constraint. Put a new driver on there, keep refueling, drive. Theoretically, the bus never had to blow up. but no matter what they did, it would blow up at 11 o'clock. So it feels a little weird at the end, and there's a couple of reasons why. He goes off then and he fights the villain. He goes off and he fights the villain. And that's after the bus is blown up, after the time limit, the time lock has ended. Well, when's this story going to be over, we wonder? Well, I guess when the villain gets disposed of or the hero gets disposed of, one way or another. But that's even beyond the limit. That wasn't even the limit. It's beyond the bus going below the mileage and blowing up, so why is all this tagged on? Wouldn't it have been much more interesting if he had had to sneak off the bus to avoid the constraints of not allowing anyone off the bus, and then after that he has to fight the guy on the subway, recognizing he's running out of time, and even though that they're continually making sure the bus is going by refueling in flight or whatever as it were, that time is running, and unless he disposes of the villain quickly, even if he gets the villain, the bus is going to blow up anyway because they're out of time. Then you have some real pressure. Then he disposes of the villain, and you've still got tension because the clock is still ticking, and he's got to make it back to the bus and get on there and get the rest of the people off before the timer goes off. Okay? That's what should have drawn it to a conclusion. So it wasn't as tight as it could have been. Not that it was a bad movie at all. It's very exciting. Blew me away. But it's still not as good as it could have been. And this is another sideline important point. Structure does not have to be perfect. It just has to be good enough. Now, how do you know if it's good enough or not? Well, if it's perfect, it's good enough. If it's less than perfect, it may or may not be. Some story points are crucial. They're so fundamental, foundational, that if you have one wrong, even just a little bit wrong, the whole story will come crashing down. Others are more peripheral, more tangential. They're not as essential to the story holding together. And so maybe it'll creak a little, maybe the bolts will be a little loose, maybe it'll sway a bit, but your structure will stand. The real point is, make sure that you get all of the important structural story points in there to have a firm foundation. And then with the rest of them, if you want to stretch them a little because you just have some interesting storytelling that you'd like to throw in, or because there's just something that you got excited about this story in the first place because of, and you said, this is why I want to tell the story, but now that you've worked it out structurally, that would not work, that would structurally not work. Well, if it's not a major structural problem, go ahead and weaken your structure, because the storytelling you do will be so exciting if this particular piece of material excites you. It'll be so powerful. It'll be so interesting to your audience that they will come away with a better story experience having a slightly weaker structure and a slightly more powerful storytelling, or perhaps a massively more powerful storytelling. It's a balance between the two. Don't let the house of cards fall down, but arrange it as ornately as you'd like to, even if that requires putting a little bit off true.